Skeptic Zone, a miracle of technology. A universe of reason, the Skeptic Zone.
Hello and welcome to the Skeptic Zone, show number 27 for the 24th of April. A special show with our guest, Rob Morrison. Now, a lot of you will remember, especially if you're in Australia, will remember Rob Morrison from the Curiosity Show. But he's also a professorial fellow at Flinders University in South Australia, specialising in zoology. But in today's show, he's going to talk to us all about the days of the Curiosity Show and his other media interests. Also in today's show, we have a little adventure where Dr. Rachie and I go on a search for hot salami, more about that later, and a grain of salt with Iran Sergeyev. But let's start straight away with our interview with Dr. Rob Morrison. And now we're delighted to be here in beautiful Bridgewater in South Australia talking to Rob Morrison. Hello, Rob.
G'day.
G'day. Very great to be here. What a beautiful place you have. I'm looking out the window now to a gorgeous view with the gum trees and everything, but I know you are a little bit wary of bushfires.
Yes, we have a lot of native scrub here, and you can see it's a little 5-acre valley, and you look out over it, and then beyond that it goes into some of the rare patches of native scrub remaining in the Adelaide Hills. It's only got about 3% left of original forest. So we look after it pretty well, but there is a reserve close to it which was on fire 3 times in the last week. It kept flaring up. And we are rebuilding at the moment, so you sat on the roof trying to put things together while bombers flew overhead and helicopters zoomed down on you, and it was a bit like World War II.
Yeah.
But fortunately it didn't do a huge amount of damage. The wind was down, so in the aftermath of those terrible Victorian fires, everyone's very spooked.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. Well, let's go right back to the beginning because, as I said in the introduction, a lot of our Australian listeners will certainly remember you from the Curiosity Show with Dean Hutton. How did that all come about?
Well, it's the only show, I think, which had about 4 different starts. It began... It's a long story. I'll keep it as brief as I can. Adelaide, for some reason, when television started, always had children's television. It's just something that the channels did, and Channel 9 particularly did a thing called Channel 9ers. It was just something that they chose to do, and I think they were really unique in doing it.
Humphrey the Bear is...
No, that was another thing. A lot of them had preschooler programs, and Humphrey was Channel 9's, and there was a Fat Cat one on Channel 7, and a lot of the channels had preschool programs, which were designed to be played during the day and in the morning, when older kids were in school. But the Broadcast Control Board brought out an edict which said, suddenly, you will now start making programs for children of school-going age, and they will be played in out-of-school hours. So suddenly they were after an older school child with its own time slot, which is called the C slot, and I think it was 4 to 5 on weekdays.
Yeah.
And the channels all suddenly found they had to start making programs for that.
Well, this is about the early 70s, was it, we're talking?
It was... Yes, it would have been early 70s. Yes, early 70s, that's right.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't know what to do with this, and Channel 9's response was to say, well, we'll keep a Humphrey program, but we'll put older stuff into it, which was a pretty appalling notion, because we had Humphrey who couldn't speak, and everything was mime and gesticulation, and then you had people like me who were aiming for 10 to 13-year-olds trying to do serious stuff with this idiot bear behind you, upstaging not exactly doing rabbit ears, but the next best thing for 3-year-olds. In fact, I have the dubious distinction of being, I think, the only person who's ever made Humphrey talk on television. It's not a nice story, but if pressed, I'll give it to you. But anyway, so we had this strange hybrid, and for many years, my papers are in the archives now, and the running sheets of these programs all say the F program, because that's what they said when they felt they had to make this thing. So for years it was known as Humphrey B. Bear's F program, and then the F program. And I had a Churchill Fellowship in 72 to go overseas, and I was working on the program for a year. And I was really working at getting rid of the bear, because the bear's terrific for his age group.
Oh, yeah.
It's silly to try and mix the two. And so that happened, and then we became a program for 10 to 13-year-olds. And for quite some time it was a pretty awful program. It was an hour long and all things to all children, which I don't think you can be, and quite a lot of presenters and no clear focus. And Dean and I grew so unhappy with this. At one stage we said, look, we don't really want to do this anymore, but we suggest you do this. And we suggested a half-hour program with a science and technology base that we would do, leaving all the other stuff to go into the Channel 9ers, which was a much more happy arrangement because it was the mix of all things to all people, and we took the science and technology and ran with that. And that's the Curiosity Show, I'm glad to say, that people remember.
Right.
And that's the one that went overseas to 14 countries and won the awards. And
because I remember
got
the
an
Curiosity Show with more people in it. Was it
That's
called,
right.
Was it called the Curiosity Show with more people, or was it called something else?
Yes, it was. And that's right. You're remembering the early 1 hour All Things to All People
Right,
show.
because they had females in it and songs
That's right.
and all
That's
sorts
right.
of things.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was a direct spin-off from Humphrey. But
Right.
I think it was, memory fails me a bit, but I think it was about 84. No, it must have been earlier. We moved it to this half-hour program. And
Oh, it must have been earlier than 84, I would think.
It would have been.
Yeah.
But this was this when, Rob, you were doing it in your spare time, outside of your full-time job?
Yes, I was lucky in that my university, a lot of universities took the line that, if you're a serious academic in science, you didn't talk to the media. The kind of mantra we grew up with was talk to the media and professionally you're finished. Now scientists are being told if you don't talk to the media,
You're finished.
But in those days it wasn't like that. But I was more in the teaching line. I did research, but I was particularly interested in teaching. And I had started, how I got into this was complete accident. The students come up and say, oh, how do we get into television? My example is not one you'd want to follow, because I'd done a bit with ABC educational television, and I thought I knew how this worked. You came in and you talked it through and you had a cup of tea, and then you'd set the lights and have another talk and have a cup of tea, and then have a bit of a rehearsal and break for lunch, and then you come back and reset the lights and do all that and have a couple of takes and then finally do, at the end of the day you'd done a really good one and off you went. So having done that, I was hand-rearing a little possum. I used to hand-rear a lot of animals. The bite marks you can see in the cedar around this room are wombat.
Oh, really?
They love the sensation of sinking these huge incisors into cedar.
Oh, you can see them.
And the back of the chair, you can see it on the rocket. They love it. But I was hand-rearing this possum, and the woman who was on Humphrey said, would you come in and talk about the possum? And I said, sure. So I went in, and there was the presenter, who actually then became the presenter on Curiosity Show.
Right.
But I sat down beside her, and she started to talk about this possum, and I thinking this was, the initial talk-through, just talked away about the possum, and then she said thank you and went out of the room, and I thought, I must have gone to get her makeup on, and I was still sitting there. Came back and said, are you still here? I said, yeah, waiting to do the segment, thinking, we had to do block-throughs and set the lights. She said, done it, go, got to get on. So I left, most bemused, wondering what I'd said. And they rang me the next day and said, we couldn't help noticing you were extremely relaxed on camera. We're looking for a presenter. Would you like to be one? And I at least had the wit not to say I didn't know I was on. So I said, yes, I could do that. And then I wasn't so relaxed when I got to the studio, but I was there.
Wow.
So I really fell into it by accident.
Right.
But that was it was terrific. Dean at that stage was an academic too.
Right.
And so we would come in on Wednesday night, have dinner and do the show. And so our daytime activities were academic, our nighttime was the Curiosity Show.
How many shows?
And the weekends was getting ready for your segment.
How many shows would you do in a session?
It varied. We probably did, in the end, I think it was 49. It varied depending on the contracts. We were bought up by Germany, and they then syndicated it. So we went to 14 countries, and they all wanted different numbers. So Sometimes they repeat, sometimes it justified doing extra for a year. But I think the maximum was, from memory, 39. Normally splits down to sort of 26 or 13. So
how long would you be
39.
stuck in the studio or doing?
Oh, we would start. We would have a working dinner to get ready for it. Then you'd go in and you'd finish. You meant to finish, I think, by 12. Sometimes we didn't.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'd then sit down and have the meeting for the next show because there's no other time.
Wow.
But then you'd work up your own segment, and my workshop out there was the kind of place you'd prototype everything. And that itself was hard. Dean and I, we did a lot of making and doing stuff.
You did.
And I said I didn't think we should ever put anything on that you couldn't see working. Because when I was a kid and you got these books on how to build aeroplanes and things, I can remember struggling, doing what I thought they were telling me how to do, and then you'd wind up the propeller and let it go and it'd sink like a bloody stone. you ended up thinking, oh, I'm no good at this. It's really undermining of your abilities. Now I look at those plans, and they were obviously written by some drunk on a Friday when he was trying to get off for the weekend, or they could never work. Never work in a fit.
Yeah.
Or they didn't tell you how thick to make things or how strong the wire should be, all those vital elements. So they were really setting kids up for failure.
Yeah.
So I said, let's make sure that everything we tell children how to make, we show working at the end. A, because they know it will work, and B, they'll see the limitations. They make a propelled plane, and they think it's going to fly around the room for hours. Well, it might have 10 seconds left in it.
Yes.
And I made a thing called an orthocopter. It was actually the first mechanical device that ever flew under its own power, designed by George Cayley. It's a bit like a bow and arrow, but instead of the arrow, you have a spindle, and it's got... mine was made out of... the spindle was a skewer, and I put a cork on each end of it. And then you put 4 chook feathers in, twisted, so they're like a propeller. But of course, chook feathers, because this action and reaction being equal and opposite, the top part will turn clockwise and the bottom part will turn sort of the other way. But you've got to get chook feathers which have got the right camber. And chook feathers are either right or left cambered. Oh. You go to the wing. So you have to sort of scavenge these feathers and put them in. But this thing, you set it going, and it will fly into the air and come down again. I think about 3 seconds in it.
Yeah.
Now, if you're going to make one of these, you don't want to expect it to be sort of zooming around the neighbourhood. So
That's right.
Showing how things actually did work in the end was, I think, a really important thing. And if we couldn't get it to that stage, we'd abandon it. And that would sometimes be after a weekend of making prototypes.
Yeah.
It had several stages. You'd think, right, I'm going to make something that flies.
Yes.
So you'd make it out of anything, balsa, springs, whatever you had that would make it work. Then you had to deconstruct it and make it out of things a kid might have at home.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Because there's no good being in Jamestown or somewhere and seeing this show on a Saturday afternoon when you haven't got a hobby shop and you can't buy balsa and you haven't got the money. So you'd find foam meat trays, a very good substitute for balsa.
Oh.
And, shoe polish tins would be very good instead of a Petri dish. You could use anything. And then sort of your prototype number 2 was using these everyday objects. And then you'd say, you'll find these around the home and do it like that.
I made a hovercraft from a margarine container.
That's the stuff. That's the stuff.
Paddle pop sticks
Yeah.
and a little electric motor.
Okay, yes, right,
Yes,
yeah.
and it went across the floor, and I
Yeah.
was chuffed.
That's right.
It was really. Oh, for our international listeners, a chook is a chicken.
Which I can hypnotise, by the way. That was
I'm
a
sure
popular
you
segment. Then I had some father coming up and abusing me because he hypnotised a chook in front of his children and it died. I think it was a very old chook, but it didn't come around again and he was affronted.
Now, how did you work out the split between the lovely things you could make and the children could make with you, and the puzzles and the games and all the other things that you would explain on the show?
Well, it was an evolutionary process, but the one that sort of settled on was that we would Dean and I would do a 4-minute segment, which is the big make and do, a 2-minute segment, and I think it was 1 or 2 1-minute segments.
Only a 4-minute segment for the make and do.
Well, it's half an hour program.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could extend that if you said, look, mine's going to be a bit longer. I'd like to use my 2-minute in my 4. You could, but
just shows how the memory plays tricks, because I would have sat back and said to you, now, obviously when you made something it would have taken at least 10 minutes. My memory would tell me that, but I'm sure you're right. I mean,
that's
you were
where the
there.
phrase,
Yeah.
I've got one here that I prepared earlier, entered the lexicon. Because These days, of course, you'd probably go into speed up, and we were starting to do that. But I mean, when I started with the ABC, we were using black and white 16mm film.
Wow.
Then you went to black and white television, video, and then you start. I mean, we were, I think, in Adelaide anyway, the first show in colour, because we'd been making it in colour for quite some time before colour hit the screen. In fact, I was in colour in black and white. There's a wonderful device you can make. I wish I could show it here for your listeners, but it's a thing called a Benham disc, named after the bloke who discovered it. And you've probably seen it. It's just a disc which is sort of radiating black.
Was this on the show?
Yeah, it was.
I'm sure I remember it from the show.
Yeah, you may well have, because in fact it's purely black and white. But if you spin this thing, because these radiating black sort of stripes and patterns are, you imagine, say it's a circle with about 4 or 5 circles within it.
That's right. Yeah.
It's got these little black bits, and of course the flicker that they create on your retina will fire some of your cone cells, which are the ones that see colour. And you can, if you speed this up and slow it down, see every colour in the rainbow. They're faint, but they work. And it works on black and white television.
Oh, right.
So we can actually project colour through black and white. But, yes, we'd be 4, 2 and 1s. And then you had a sort of hello and goodbye.
Yeah.
Which were usually a puzzle.
Yes.
And that way we could get quite a lot of material in, but also keep the variety up so it didn't drag. And we tended to use commercial breaks. We like to subvert them a bit by setting up a puzzle before them and then showing you the solution to the puzzle straight afterwards. So you had a bit of thinking time. If you didn't want to watch the commercial, you could muck around with coins or matches or something of that kind.
That's very good. Of course, the beauty is now, especially for our international listeners who are listening to this on their computers or whatever, they can either right now or after the interview run to YouTube, type in The Curiosity Show, and see what we're talking about.
Yes, there are a few. There are people who have pirate versions, and they're starting to put them up.
Yeah.
And Dean and I have been thinking about re-releasing some stuff on DVD.
I
think we better get at it. Because
I was going to ask you about that. Is the show archived so you can do that?
Yes, a lot of it is. And I've got boxes and boxes of VHSs of the shows, because we, after a certain time, asked if we could monitor it at home. They put a few things to air that we didn't like, that hadn't been corrected.
Huh?
So we said, let's have a VHS of each show, and we could look at it at home and say, oh, this needs correction. So I've got, I suppose, about 12 years' worth of shows just sitting as VHS boxes. There's nowhere to put them in this house. It's hopeless.
So you're suggesting that the show is archived, but you have it?
Well, Dean and I have an archive of it on VHS.
Not the network?
The network has an archive of it on, the broad commercial tape.
Yeah.
But we rather lost track of that, and they're in some trouble at the moment, so we're not the Ninewood, the production house that we made this program with. So we're trying to negotiate with them, but we're not getting any responses.
Really?
So we have to follow that one up.
Because something I found interesting, I was watching a documentary about Dad's Army a little while ago, and they found some missing episodes because the BBC would reuse tapes, and the story of a lot of programs have been lost forever because at the time they were broadcast, I thought, well, that's it, we'll use the tape again for the next show or something. And it occurs to people now that that's part of our cultural heritage. And I mean, I'm not here to unnecessarily flatter you, but the Curiosity Show is part of Australia's cultural heritage. It really is.
Well, it's kind of you. The very early stuff, I think, is gone. I do have 1 or 2 very early tapes of it, but you've got to find the machine that will play them now.
Yeah.
But that's no loss to anyone, I think. It's not a show I particularly want to be associated with. But the later one we're proud of. But we have a lot of that. And I think, the beauty about science is it's timeless. I
was just about to say, it doesn't. You could release it now on a wonderful DVD collection, and it would still be absolutely relevant.
They'd marvel at the funny haircuts and strange shirts, but Dean and I thought, this is not a show where you try and project personality. That our role is to be the medium of the stuff that we do. And so you get the camera off you quite quickly onto your hands, what you're doing. And it was quite gratifying. Kids would come up in the street and say, "Hey, Dean, that thing you made." And I said, "Well, I'm actually Rob." He said, "No, you're Dean." And, and then they'd talk about some segment they'd seen, and they couldn't actually remember which of us had done it, and it didn't really matter because they were interested in what you'd done.
Yeah.
And that, to me, was the show being successful.
Marvellous, yeah.
It was not the sort of show where you try and become an identity or anything like that. And I think that's why it had a long life. We were on air for 18 years.
Wow.
And that's a long time for a show. But I think it's the material. If you try and make it a personality thing, you might have a high peak, but you're over in 3. So the material is timeless. I mean, you can go and take those segments. I've done it. I've been working for Nexus, which is our Asia-Pacific television program. And a lot of it's recycled curiosity show because, colour, rainbows, refraction, they're all stuff that are endlessly effective and very interesting and easy to show visually. It's great.
True. I remember very well one segment you did where you were discussing why some sand is squeaky. Do you remember doing that?
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I was about to do that in a show the other day. That and quicksand.
Yeah. He is walking along and he goes, squeak, 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 and you explain the different... And I remember this so clearly because of the rock, the uniformity of the rock, the grains.
Well, it's quartz rather than shell. Shell sand won't squeak.
Yeah.
But if it's ground down quartz, they're like little marbles.
Yes.
And that sand actually came from Wilson's Promontory. There's a beach called Squeaky Beach. And I probably was not allowed to take it, but I thought I can use this, and I went away with a small container.
Because when you did the segment, and I remember thinking this at the time, is he at the beach or is he in the studio? Because it was very well done. It must have been with a green screen or something.
When that came in, I mean, all these things were... I think it was the heyday of television because you had all these new technologies and you could use them for the first time and experiment with them and do wonderful things. I still remember one newsreader once when they were using blue screens and he had blue eyes. And
I think that was Ross Simons, I think.
And you could see sort of crowds rioting through his iris. Frightening picture. But it was a lot of fun. So we think we might... there is this strange audience that we didn't know about who's discussing it on YouTube. I would have thought they're too young, but they can remember it. I mean, it did get syndicated. It went to Ravensburger, and they dubbed it into German.
I've seen that on YouTube.
But I saw it in Germany. I used to live in Germany in the early 90s, and flipping the channels one day, there you were with Dean.
Yeah.
Hallo, liebe Kinder, wir sind hier, and away you went in German.
Well, it's very eerie because they're very good at it in Ravensburger, and they get actors with your voice.
Yeah.
So there's a German actor who has my voice, and my German is limited to a little bit of science German, so I can't follow what I'm saying, but I know what I did. And they'll lip sync your intakes of breath, your laughter.
Wow. Oh, it's marvellous.
Extraordinarily good. And it can lead to trouble because I was on the ski field here with my students once, and a German family came past, very excited and calling out to me in German.
Oh no!
I was saying, "I'm sorry, I don't speak German." They said, "Yes, you do. We watch you." I was saying, "Yes, but that's no, you speak." And they thought I was sort of pretending not to get rid of them, which was not at all the case.
And it's got, not only Germany, of course, but you were saying other countries.
Yes, of course. And then they went to Switzerland and lots of... I mean, Europe is quite tight in the sort of overlap of who can see what. It got pirated too. We know it's turned up in a few places.
As in copied or other people doing it?
And also it was just knocked off and people would...
do the same sort of show with other people?
I think people... I think people broadcast it who weren't paying for it.
Oh, I see. Right.
But it did get copied. Yeah. There is still some stuff called Curiosity Show out there, which has nothing to do with us.
Right. I mean, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because in one way it's marvellous that people do that because at least it's still getting out the fun and the message. But again, it's...
Well, you can't be too precious about it.
Yeah.
I mean, we did invent quite a lot of things. You see that and you think, that's mine. But on the other hand, you picked up ideas from everywhere and used them. And so, give and take a bit. So, yes, one of the things that really took off for me was the Mousetrap Racer. I don't know if you ever saw that. It's a wonderful thing for children. You can do a great deal with it for understanding gears and, acceleration and things. And you get a mousetrap. and you put screw eyes underneath it. So you can imagine it with sort of 4 screw eyes, almost at the corners.
Mm-hmm.
And they are lined front to back. And then you can put an axle through those.
Right.
And little wheels on it.
Yeah.
So you've got a mousetrap now just riding along on 4 wheels. But if you rig it properly, you can take a thread from the bar of the mousetrap and wrap it, cock the mousetrap, and then wrap that thread around the back axle.
Yes.
Now when you set the mousetrap off, the bar tries to come forward, it pulls on the thread, that unwinds from the axle and then goes zzzz across the room. Or you hope it will. Sometimes it spins on the spot, sometimes the wheels spin, but then you can work out how to make it work better. Do you go for distance, in which case you won't get much speed? Do you go for speed, in which case it won't go very long? And I've converted that into the mousetrap paddle wheeler, which will chug across a dam very nicely with cotton wool and plastic cut from an ice cream container lid. Make the paddles out of that, and that chugs along quite well. And that got picked up and used in a National Science Week nationally, and then it got used in another television program. And I thought, hello, there's my segment. When I thought about it, I actually got it out of a magazine for children that a friend lent me who'd been to America.
Right.
So,
right.
you know, you
adapt,
really,
yeah.
and I think people have to be expected to adapt your stuff. And again, you know, science, it's everlasting. It's nobody's. It's just
there's a certain amount of it's flattering if people think so highly of what you've done that they knock it off or copy it. I mean, there is a certain amount of that.
Oh yeah, I suppose there is. It's but, you know, some things I see things now. I think, I wish the show was still going. I could use that.
I bet you do.
But you were doing some television recently, Rob, weren't you? Doing The New Inventors a little bit for the
Yeah,
ABC
Steve and I were asked to do some segments on that, really explaining how everyday items work or not such everyday items, how fridges work, and you know how you can crack macadamia nuts without cracking the nuts and stuff of that kind. Mm-hmm. People would write in with questions and we'd field them. And then they stopped using us, but they didn't stop asking the questions. So people keep writing in questions, wondering why we're not attending it.
It's interesting. But, I wonder why they... Oh, well.
Well, we don't know. It may come back again, but I think finance has got to everybody.
Oh, okay.
You probably get asked this a lot. I mean, why don't you and Dean do another series? Because there's a lot of pretty substandard TV out there.
Well, yes. I mean, it's hard to know. First of all, you can't just say, we want to do one and go and do one. You've got to interest a network. But networks are now... Everyone's worried about audiences turning off. So why are you going to put money into a show when you can run a game show? Or you can have a quiz show or something that's really cheap, which pays for itself and that the audience comes along and is happy to participate.
Or reality
You can
show.
set up a few prizes, that's your cost, but then again if you rig it so people have to ring in a particular phone line to do something, you make your money out of that, so it's cost neutral.
Yes.
So an awful lot of television is now, I think low in production values, but also low in cost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty hard to get anybody to say, well, yes, we'll run with this because it's science. We won't get a big audience, and all those things that we used to hear.
Yeah.
So I suspect that the days of shows like that are over. But on the other hand, there's an awful lot of stuff now on the internet.
Oh yes.
And indeed, if you like the sort of stuff we did, you can go around the internet and find all sorts of stuff like it.
Absolutely.
And people are doing that for nothing.
Yeah.
And I think the days of selling your content are probably gone. I grew up in that. I wrote books and I did television, and you sold your content. Now people are giving the content away free, and they're making their money out of the advertising. So if you've got a good website that lots of people are going to come and watch because of the content, you can sell advertising space on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's where people are now, the entrepreneurs in the new age, are making their money. So I think all that's gone. I think if you try and set up another show like that for free-to-air television, particularly as digital's coming in and people have so much choice,
that's true.
I don't think you'd do awfully well.
Do you know if the show is still being repeated around the world at the moment?
I've heard that it still rattles around in cable somewhere, but we've lost track of anybody doing it properly.
Right.
We should know. We should be informed,
I suppose you should,
but
yes.
We don't know.
Coming up after the break, where Dr. Rachie and I go on our search for a hot salami, Rob Morrison talks about some of his concerns with science reporting in the media.
Hi, I'm Theo Clark, host and producer of the podcast Hunting Humbug 101. Each week I'm joined by my father, Jeff Clark, and we discuss a particular logical fallacy with real-life examples of fallacies from pseudoscience, science misconceptions, politics, philosophy and the media.
Hunting Humbug 101 is a companion podcast to our book, Humbug, The Skeptic's Field Guide to Spotting Fallacies in Thinking. You can download them and subscribe to our podcast, obtain a free copy of the ebook version of our book, Humbug, and see many more real examples of fallacious reasoning at our website, www.skepticsfieldguide.net.
Now, let's all get back to enjoying the zone.
Rachel, can you believe it? We're at the Central Markets in Adelaide.
Yes, we are. Isn't it incredible?
People everywhere. It's beautiful here.
It is. It's an amazing market. I think it's one of the best, as I said, in Australia, if not the world, maybe. But It's very famous, and it's wonderful there.
Look at the lovely fruit and fresh corn. Look at the corn in front of us. Oh, that looks good.
You like corn,
I
don't
do.
you?
And now we're here for a very special reason. We're going to the Metworth shop.
Yes, we are.
And we're going to buy bum burners and fire starters.
And fire starters, yeah. Do you want to explain to the listeners what fire starters and bum burners are, Richard?
Well, imagine an incredibly delicious salami. The flavour is just to die for. Mm-hmm. That's a bum burner. Mm. Now imagine that same thing encased in chilies. That's a fire starter.
Wrapped in chili flakes.
Wrapped in chili flakes.
Yeah.
So let's not delay, Rachel.
All right, let's go to the Metworth shop.
I think it's probably down here.
Yeah.
Here we are. We found it, the Metworth shop. I can see. Oh, look. Oh, can you believe? I've got to take a picture of that. I've just taken a picture, listeners, of the fire starters. If you go to our website, www.skepticzone.tv, and click the pictures, you can see this incredible sight. I think we should buy some.
Let's buy some, Richard.
We couldn't help ourselves, could we?
No, we bought $30 worth of fire starters and we already had some, didn't we, Richard?
Yeah, we did.
And now we can't really speak. The chili is so
good.
full on.
So the taste, though. I mean, the chili gives you a big whack, but that beautiful flavour.
It is amazing, isn't it?
This is a free ad for the Metworth shop.
I'm not sure. Oh.
Just Google Metworth.
Metworth shop, Central Market, stall 22.
Adelaide. Yum. So how much money did we spend today on
Metworth? $30 on fire starters this morning.
Yeah.
And then we went away. Thank you. We went away and thought about it.
Yeah.
And then we came back and spent $8 more on 6 bum burners. Yes.
So they've done quite well out of us today.
They have. In fact, they gave us a discount, Richard, because the second time we went back, we should have paid $11 for the bum burners. And we only
very
paid
good to
$8.
us.
Yes.
Well, I'm sure they don't get many people coming up and buying $30 worth of the fire starters.
No, but they did say to us when we went back for the bum burners, have you already finished those fire starters? Because it's only been a few hours have lapsed since we've been there.
Now, our listeners probably are wondering what this has to do with skepticism. Nothing. It's just good fun.
It's yummy. So, Rob, you were going to tell us how you managed to get Humphrey B. Bear, the bear who doesn't normally speak, to speak. Can you tell us that story?
I didn't mean to, but we had an outside broadcast. You didn't get the van very often, but sometimes it was free and they'd say, go and do it. This is back in the very early days when we had Humphrey in the show. So I said, right, we'll take it out to my laboratory and we'll set that up during the day and we'll record in it at night. So we did that. A lot of technical stuff of getting the three-phase in. And I dressed it with various interesting scientific gizmos, including a Van de Graaff generator, which has just been repaired. Now, that's the one you see in science shows where children stand on a box and touch it and all their hair stands on end because it generates vast voltage. And this had been going for some time, and it was a nice dry night, and the thing had just been overhauled, so it was in good nick. And we had this segment. I was doing something with insects, I think, and there was this wretched bear behind me. I knew he was behind me, gesticulating and pointing at things and trying to attract his 3-year-olds not to look at my segment, but at him. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see him pointing at these gizmos, including the Van de Graaff, and pointing quite close to the Van de Graaff. I thought, I won't say anything, we'll see what happens here. And I could hear the sort of flurry of pointing going on behind me. And then there was suddenly a crack like a rifle shot. And I just turned around, saw an arc of blue fire about a metre long. It leapt from the Van de Graaff into the outstretched digit of the unhappy bear. He did a quick 360, and from the depths of this woolly costume, you just heard... I think it's the only thing Humphrey has ever said on television.
Did that go to air?
It did. Faintly.
Oh, I wish that was on YouTube. I'd love to find that.
Yes, I wish I had a copy of that program. But he was then very subdued and didn't gesticulate any more and didn't point at anything. And I was able to finish my segment unmolested.
Can you tell us, Rob, about the live shows that you do now? You did one for the Skeptics Convention
yes.
late last year, which was very successful and great fun as well.
Well, that was a sort of spin-off of one that Dean and I do for Science Alive. Science Alive is a very big thing we have in National Science Week in Adelaide. And it's funded by the National Science Week in Canberra, and they give grants to all states. And they do it very well, I think. They try and get the maximum coverage and the maximum fairness. But this is our premier event in South Australia, and they fund that. So we were able to put on this huge kind of... It was 2 days, and now 3 days, because we can make 1 day just for schools. But its focuses on science and technology, and science as a career, and the schools days is all about the science you can... all that. But, of course, they need to keep people entertained, so they have science shows. And they wheel Dean and myself out to do old curiosity show stuff. Which, of course, is hard, because a lot of what we did was tabletop and finger tight. It's really close-up. You can't do that for a crowd. So we tend to rely upon the usual happy things of explosions and rockets
the
and
explosions were
and things of
particularly
this kind.
impressive,
And so we'd done one, I think, on... Dean and I wrote 4 books on earth, fire, air and water at one stage, which are all sort of projects you could do around those. So we modified that into a stage show, and we modify it as need demands.
It was very, very well received at the convention when you did it.
No, it's nice. It's nice.
And I thought it was particularly nice, the demonstration of an earthquake.
Oh, right.
Very clever with the balloons and the
Tabletops,
ups and tables and everything. That was wonderful.
But you do hope for some children. You don't need many children in an audience, and then the whole audience has a kind of vicarious 10-year-old's interest in a show. If you haven't got one, you have to ask adults to pretend to be children.
Right.
It doesn't work so well. But if there's 1 or 2, they all think, we're watching this through his eyes or her eyes.
Yes.
And that works quite well.
Yes.
So
That's a good
you had a
point.
couple there for us. That was good.
Well, a couple of years ago, Rob, you won the Australian Skeptics Prize for Critical Thinking. And I wonder if you can tell us about that. What was your entry about?
It was about... It was a bit of a mea culpa in some ways, but I'd from the Curiosity Show, I kept doing academic stuff, and then Channel 10 News wanted a science reporter to do features. And again, I tell students who want to get into television, don't neglect science, because I had never trained as a journo. My father was a journo, but I'd never trained as a journo. But for 10, it was harder to find a journo who could do science than it was to find a scientist who'd done television. Mm-hmm. And I was the latter. So I went into the newsroom, and I spent 10 years there just doing a segment a week, a feature a week on science and technology and environment. Absolutely loved it. It was a great place to work. And after that, I'd left the university by then, and was too young to retire. I think I'll always be too young to retire. I like working. But a job came up at Adelaide University in the media unit for a science journalist, and I thought, well, I'll have a go at that, and I got it. It was a 2-year contract. The brief was to get the university's research into the international media, which sounds horrendous, but is actually easier to do than getting it into the local media.
Is that right?
Yeah, you have a parochial bottleneck sometimes.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
there are mechanisms you can use which expose your story to the world, and somebody says, I like that, and they'll grab it. Particularly freelancers who have to go scouting for stories that no one else is onto. So that was a very happy time, and I grew interested then in the mechanisms of getting a story. I mean, for 10 years I'd been in the newsroom, and press releases had come to me, and I'd had people saying, use my story. Now I was on the other side, the dark side we call it, saying, right, here's a story you ought to use instead of anybody else's. And you start to get aware of other people doing it and the tricks that they're using. And a lot of those are very effective in the short term. But I think in the long term, they lose their power, but by then they've damaged science very badly. What do I mean? Well, I recently looked up Eureka Alert, probably the biggest and the most effective science news release website in the world. And it's very good. But I looked up, I think it's about 5,000 press releases I looked up on it, of which 2,200 and something had breakthrough. Okay,
yes.
and about half that had cutting edge,
Yes.
and about as many had leading edge or that sort of stuff. It's the kind of degraded currency of trying to present science as really important.
Yeah.
So the sloppy journalist or the sloppy PR merchant who says, crikey, I've got to get something in the media. How do I make it interesting enough for them to want? I call it breakthrough, cutting edge, leading edge, world first. And so every story that comes out is described as a breakthrough. And it can be just commonplace science, the sort that gets done every day. But that gets called a breakthrough. Then what happens when everything's a breakthrough to the real breakthroughs? They're sort of lost in this sea of hyperbole. So I started to get worried about that. I looked at there are a number of ways people hype these science stories. One is to not talk about what has been discovered and published in a refereed journal, which gives it some credibility, but to talk about so-and-so who's doing work on this, which may lead to, and then off you go. You can say whatever you like.
Right.
We're even getting stories now on so-and-so who's won a prestigious grant to begin work on X, which, if he's successful, might lead to Y, which could cure Z.
Yeah.
And the story is about curing Z. So that if you look at a lot of stories now, they're not about honest research, well done, and demonstrably well done because they're in the refereed journals. They're about work that might lead to this, might cure that. And the stem cell, when I got that award, I did an analysis of stem cell publications and the way they were being hyped. And Eureka Alert again, 10 stories, 3 of them were factual stories, the other 7 were all this hyperbolic stuff about what stem cells would one day cure. Now, if you go to people in the street, you say, what do stem cells do? They'll tell you, quite convinced, that all these things that they cure, now, they're starting to, in some cases. But in many cases, they're still years away from clinical trials. So the hyperbole gets established in the mind as fact, and then, doesn't come up with the goods. I mean, biotechnology was where, 20 years ago, everyone was going to make millions.
That's right.
There are hardly any biotechnology companies doing well on the stock exchange, hardly any. A lot of them are faltering. A great many can't get any money to develop the good patents that they've got. And a lot of people have lost money. They haven't made money on the stock exchange. So the hyperbole is very damaging to science because it degrades the currency. And I think it's happening more and more because we used to just get our money from the government and we could research more or less what we liked in universities. Now there's less of that money. You've got to go and find your money. People are only going to pay for stuff which is going to have a payoff at the end. A lot of it's coming out of corporate bodies. They've got media units in them. They've got PR units. They've got to be seen to be active. They've got to get the name in the media. So you've got middle managers who don't give a stuff about the science, but they're really keen on getting the company's name into the media, and they'll do it any way they can. So you take something which is not worthy of a story, call it a breakthrough, cutting-edge science, imagine where it might one day go and try and get your story out of that. But all the good stuff is then suddenly dropping off the edge. And there's a measure that tells you how much that's happening. If you look at Eureka Alert, it rates its stories with relevance. And in fact, I've just been doing some media lectures to biotechnology students at one of our universities, and their task is to go away to look at these stories, look at the relevance factor, and evaluate the news value of the story against the science value, because those two are now diverging.
Right, yeah.
And you can make a story very effective in terms of news, but when you look at the science in it, it's crappy.
Yeah.
And something which is really strong scientifically may not be deemed to be newsworthy. And that's the danger, that at the time we're trying to improve the science and the media, there are these forces which are really pushing one way for the media impact and another way for the scientific validity.
So that's what your prize was about? The story you wrote about the stem cells? Yes,
it was about the problem, and it was about the analysis of it and the sort of research, if you can call it that, on how I'd done it. And Australasian Science picked it up and ran with it too, and they were I mean, they get deluged with this stuff, so they were quite pleased to find somebody arguing the case.
Well, what's your opinion about scientific reporting in the sort of mainstream media? Do you think that there's a sort of, it's done well or it's done really badly? Because quite often it seems that sort of non-specialist journalists tend to report this kind of stuff, and they maybe don't have a scientific education in order to report it very well. Do you think that's a problem as well?
There's no clear answer to that, but there's several bits, I think, which are all relevant and all important. Perhaps 5 years ago I would have been fairly pessimistic about the state of it. Since then, for 3 years, we've had the Australian Science Media Centre, and I have to declare an interest. I'm on the board of that, but it was started, it was modelled on the one that Baroness Susan Greenfield started in Britain, which is the Science Media Centre. And she came out to Adelaide. We have a program called Thinkers in Residence, where people who are notable in some field get invited to Adelaide, and they spend some time and they work on a problem relevant to the state, and they produce reports and recommendations, and off they go again. Well, Greenfield was probably the most productive of all, because a huge amount came out of her visit, including the establishing of the Australian Science Media Centre. It's based in Adelaide, but it's a national body. It's got a very large board, and it probably has it's got all the major media players at a very high level who sit on the board. And its task is really to improve the dialogue between science and the media. So it has this stable of people who are good in the media, scientists who are good in the media, who can be called upon and are prepared to be called upon at a moment's notice to comment on issues of scientific interest. It sets up briefings online. I'd encourage anyone to look up the website, because you can join in on the briefings, you can hear the stuff being discussed by experts, and most of the science you're now finding in the media across Australia is coming out of those briefings, heads up, horizon scanning, a huge amount. They don't get their name in it because they keep the Science Media Centre name out. They just catalyse the coverage. But it has been a particular godsend to the science reporter who is not trained in science.
Right, okay.
The generalist who has to cover science and is often at sea. Some of the science reporters who are specialists are a bit edgy about it, because, of course, they've built up all their contacts over the years, and they know where the experts are. And then suddenly someone comes along and makes it available to everybody, and they think they've lost their edge. But, I think that's a thin argument. If I can't find an extra edge in a story with my science background, I probably shouldn't be in the trade. And, you can get an online briefing with all these experts, ask the questions that you like, everyone hears them. But you can also get them and say, look, could I have a few words afterwards, and get your particular angle, so you've got something that no one else has got. So I think that's, I think it's been a huge force for good. And when you look at the coverage, because we monitor what comes out of those briefings, it is vast, and the amount of science that's getting reported now, and reported well, is vast. The briefings are good because if somebody wants to beat a story up, in their beat-up, they know that there were 10 other journalists who were there, who heard the same thing that they did, who will be reporting it and many of them properly. So
Right.
it acts as a bit of a damper on the person who just wants to extrapolate too much. That's been extremely good. At the same time, a lot of media outlets are cutting back on science reporters. So we're losing the specialists. And I'm afraid that we're also getting people who are better at writing media releases in a way that is almost the story. And I've seen a lot of them that just make it straight from the media release into the media outlet with no change.
Yes, I've seen those too on Media Watch, actually.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's frightening because if you write it well, some little journalist under pressure says, well, that looks good to me. That's a good story. Bang,
I've got a
in
deadline,
it goes.
then it goes,
Yeah, I've had my media releases used word for word with somebody else's name on them as a byline.
Really?
And in a way it's legitimate because a media release that goes to a newsroom can be treated as the journalist sees fit. But I think it's really peculiar when every word is just put there with somebody else's name on it. I mean, it shouldn't ever be put there holus bolus anyway. A journalist should say, well, okay, that's what these people say, let's test it.
Yes.
And they just adopt it, plug, and that's worrying because a lot of stuff which is masquerading as science reports is thinly disguised advertisements for weight loss clinics and drugs on the market and crank stuff, really.
Yeah, in fact, I came across exactly what you're talking about. Last week in the Sydney Morning Herald, there was an article in the health section that was supposed to be about moisturisers for women, and it was a thinly veiled advertisement for expensive facial products, really. It was just, this product is $400 compared to that one, so you should use the $400 one. There was no critical analysis, there was no science behind it, there was nothing. And that's, in the Herald, and for someone who doesn't know much about science, they'd read that and go, oh, well, they obviously are better.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's happening more and more. So it's a very mixed bag. There's the good stuff is getting better. There's more of the good stuff, but there's also more of the bad stuff, and it's being less critically examined.
Yeah. So what else are you doing now, Rob? You're on the board of the Australian Science Media Centre. You're still teaching as well, aren't you?
No, only the occasional lecture. I'm chair of SciWorld. We're now, I think, the only state that doesn't have a science and technology centre. We did have, but the board closed it. They reckon they weren't getting enough money.
Okay.
We didn't want to see interactive science finish here, so a few of us bought those assets. And we keep going as best we can. We haven't got a premises, but we go out to other people's premises and set up there. We've got a very nice grant. We've established a robotics unit with its own van, so they can go off to schools and just set up.
Oh, wow.
And that's beautiful. But a bit of a shoestring operation, but that takes a bit of time. Doing a bit of radio work. Trying to keep busy. At the moment, building on the house, that's a full-time job. Never again.
Well, Rob Morrison, what a pleasure it has been to chat with you today. And I'm sure our listeners, especially those in Australia, will get a thrill out of hearing your stories of the Curiosity Show, because I was just saying to Rachel before, there are many people maybe in my age group, in the 40s, with young kids, who would be the Curiosity Show age kids themselves now.
Yes, we just enough to cover sort of two generations, really. It's a bit alarming. I get sort of bald, middle-aged men coming up and saying, I used to watch you when I was a boy. It's slightly frightening.
Now, I can't let you go, and I'm just reaching into my bag. I have bought a book on the internet, on eBay, Super Mind Stretchers. Which is your book.
Well, that's actually one I did with Dean. We did about 10 together.
Yeah.
And I think this was the first. It was back when Ashton Scholastic was producing a huge lot of
I used to work for Ashton Scholastic years ago, yeah.
Well, so we started with them, and then we went to Jacaranda, and we did about 10 together.
Yeah.
I've done about...
I'll have you know that cost me about $2 on these.
Well, money very well spent.
So I'd be delighted if you could autograph that for me. It would be wonderful.
Of course.
As a thank you for appearing today, I'd like to give you this DVD of Australian poetry.
Oh, thank you very much.
Which you may well enjoy, by our voiceover man, Jim Wilshire.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
That's all filmed in the beautiful Murray River area down near Albury.
Rhyming Australian poetry.
Yeah, you might well enjoy that.
Yeah, I will, indeed. I've just been... Well, I'm not really a poet. My father was a poet. I'm a doggerelist. And I've just done some for the science show, one on some lesser-known aspects of Darwin's long illness to celebrate the Darwin year. And I've just completed I reckon science has added a lot to our lives, but Shakespeare, of course, only wrote the 7 Ages of Man. Shakespeare himself popped off at 52, so he didn't even get to the 7th. But I reckon science has added such a lot that we needed 3 more ages, which I've now written for the science show. So I shall enjoy that very much indeed.
Thank you, Rob Morris.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Rob.
This stuff is far!
You're listening to Far by George Harab. You can find out more about George Harab by visiting his website at www.georgeharab.blogspot.com, where you can even find the lyrics to this song. Try singing along with it. Of course, he's singing about the 365 Days of Astronomy podcast, one podcast every day for 2009. And you can find that at 365daysofastronomy.org. Check it out. There'll be a contribution by the Skeptic Zone in May.
This stuff is far. It's really far. This stuff is far, far, far away, and we're talking far. Far. Can't get there by car in a day. It's super duper crazy far, but just pulsars, quasars, and stars. I mean, it's far, far, far. If there's some doubt, listen to a shout. This stuff is far. Grain of salt. Grain of salt. Grain of salt.
Let's all take this with a grain of salt. Here's Iran Segev.
Grain of salt now. Grain of salt, you gotta take it with a...
Hello, this is Iran Segev, taking life with a grain of salt. In most countries, formal education starts at the age of 5 or 6. In many countries, formal education is free and compulsory. This is certainly true in the developed world, though it is also increasingly true in the developing world and even in the third world. The implication is that by the time they are 18, most people will have spent more than 2/3 of their lives in an educational setting. There is little doubt that education is a positive. Education is strongly positively correlated with higher socioeconomic status, wider choice of vocations, and even better health. This positive correlation has been shown to be almost certainly causal in many studies. For example, there is now little doubt amongst researchers that one surefire way of reducing the number of children families have, and this is true in particular in the third world, is by educating women. Since having fewer children is linked with reduced poverty and increased health for the entire family, the positive effect of education is easy to see in this scenario. It is worth noting that I use qualifying terms like almost certainly, because it is impossible to unequivocally prove a one-to-one causal relationship in such a complex area. However, for all practical purposes, it can be seen as having been proven. In the privileged life of most of the population of a developed country, education is taken as a given. Truancy is frowned upon and is illegal in many countries, and even in lower socioeconomic circles, the vast majority of children attend school and usually finish high school. I will note in parentheses that the situation may be very different in what could be called third world pockets in developed countries, such as some Aboriginal communities in Australia that live in such abject poverty that the education is not considered a priority, though by all rights it should be, as there is no surer way of rising out of poverty than acquiring education. With such clear benefits, talking about the importance of education may not seem like something a skeptic should do. But like in many areas of human endeavour, in education too there are trends, traditions, and even fads and fashions, and these warrant a skeptical look. I'll start by looking at the importance of academic achievement. In Australia, as in many other countries, a good school is considered to be one in which the average grades are high. In some countries, there are school league tables in which the average marks for each school earn it a place against other schools. It is considered a major honour to be placed high in that table, and for private schools it can also mean a significant revenue boost, as parents are willing to pay more for what is considered to be better education for their children. The question that needs to be asked in this respect is whether average marks really mean much. After all, it is well known that some children just don't do that well in exams, even if they are knowledgeable and clever, and to an extent, exams simply measure the ability to pass exams. But even if we accept that exams are a good way of assessing knowledge, is knowledge really the most important educational outcome? There is some evidence that adults remember very few facts from their school years. My own experience is that the one single fact I remember from high school history is the reason for the Italo-Abyssinian War. The reason I remember it so well is that my first encounter with the historical fact that such a war had ever taken place was during my final exam, and in my shame I did some research afterwards. Personal experience aside, studies have shown that adults have been able to reconstruct knowledge but not reproduce it. In other words, the knowledge was gone and what remained was some skill that allowed the person to have a good guess at what the knowledge might have been. This is not true, of course, if some knowledge is used continuously after it is learned, and students that have a particular affinity to a specific subject tend to remember it better than their average recollection. But as a rule, it can be said that knowledge retention is such that not much of it remains several years after the end of school. Let's go one step further and assume that knowledge is very important, perhaps even the most important thing for children to acquire at school. This brings up the question of what knowledge should be taught. Of all human knowledge, only a tiny proportion is taught in school. When you have bureaucrats making choices about curriculum, which means choosing a fraction of a percent of all possibilities and deciding that they are the most important things children should know, how could we know that they got it right? In what way, for example, is studying Ulysses more important than learning the rules of the Chinese strategy game Go? I will get back to this question shortly, but first I want to offer an alternative view. If knowledge is not the most important thing learned at school, what is? I contend that there is more than one most important thing, but that all the important things are skills. Learning skills, social skills, work ethic, independence, self-organization, and also reading, writing, and numeracy, which are usually considered as basic skills, even though they involve some knowledge. Referring back to my question on James Joyce versus Chinese games, I want to present the term pluralistic education. The basic idea of pluralistic education is that curricula are not described in terms of topics. There are variations on the theme, but in general the idea is that as long as children acquire skills, it does not matter how they do. So, for example, the skill of planning ahead and thinking several steps beyond the current situation can be learned or mastered by planning and creating a scale model of a famous building, or playing Go, or through numerous other activities. Each of the activities will probably contribute to more than one skill, and probably be much more interesting for the student. For the skill of wading through 1,000 pages of impenetrable language with grit and determination, there is probably nothing that can equal Ulysses. But for being able to read a book and understand it at the many levels that a good work of literature operates on, there are literally thousands of options, and the choice of a relatively small number is related to the needs of bureaucracy, management, and teachers, not to those of students. And all that is said with a charitable assumption that being able to read a book this way is an important skill. This focus on knowledge, and more importantly on a very specific subset of human knowledge, is particularly troubling in a world that is changing so quickly that there is no practical way to know what knowledge the students of today will need in 10 years' time, or even if that knowledge exists today. Do the perceived importance of academic achievement and the actual importance of skills contradict each other? Not entirely. A student who does well academically across multiple subjects is likely to have a good measure of the skills mentioned earlier, although it is easy to imagine a student with no social skills, independence, or self-organization that just gets by on the force of parental threats. Conversely, a student with all of those skills but poor recall or with fear of exams might do very poorly. In this respect, it might be said that academic achievement, on average, is a fairly good proxy for the skills I have mentioned. My gripe is mostly with the fact that most people seem to so focus on academic achievement that it becomes important in its own right and not as a measure of other achievements and abilities. That such a focus exists can easily be seen in Australia in the high regard in which single-sex schools are held. A straw poll I conducted for this talk amongst parents whose high school children attend co-ed schools has shown that almost all of them think that single-sex schools are better. It stands to reason that the results would get closer to 100% had I also asked parents of kids who attend single-sex schools. When asked why, the almost universal answer was that kids do better academically without the interference of attention to the opposite sex. Evidence as to whether the last statement is true has been hard to come by. It is probably telling, that a lot of the information comes from sites with all-revealing names, such as singlesexschools.org. I think you know what you'll find there. I will reserve judgment on that question for the time being, due to the lack of reliable evidence, but I can't help wondering, how come this social aspect of separating boys and girls is ignored, or at least considered secondary? Being separated from the other sex is a situation that children are unlikely to encounter at any time during the rest of their lives, unless they become professional footballers or some other rare profession where almost everybody around is of the same sex. Yet the impact on preparing them for adulthood is generally not considered important enough to warrant a mention, and certainly not important enough to see single-sex schools as potentially very problematic in terms of social skills acquired by the students. One educational philosophy which generally promotes pluralistic education and puts a special emphasis on social skills is the democratic education philosophy. This is very much a growing movement around the world, though the impact in Australia has been minimal, with only about 2,000 students in all of Australia attending such schools. It's worth noting that even in schools that are not declared as democratic, there is often a move towards implementing some of the philosophies of this movement. Democratic education is much bigger in other countries, and in particular in Europe and in Israel. Democratic schools are varied in their approaches, but they all share the common view that children should have as much control over their learning and environment as possible. In some schools, this is manifested as allowing children to choose what they do on different days of the week, while leaving control over the overall mix with the teachers. In other schools, learning is not at all compulsory, as the view is that children are eager to learn and will initiate their own learning if left alone. In yet other such schools, called Sudbury Valley schools, it is considered a breach of protocol to suggest a topic to children. If they want to learn something, they'll ask, is the usual line of reasoning. How they will be exposed to new information is not something I have been able to determine. However liberal each school may be, and they're all very liberal, there are no conservative democratic schools to my knowledge, they all share the basic premise that children can set their own boundaries and should be given freedom to manage their own lives. I have to admit that I find the philosophy behind this movement appealing. I've been involved with the democratic schools movement in Australia for almost 10 years, and I still run their website and discussion groups, though I am not an active participant. Despite my close affiliation with those schools, I have been at loggerheads with several participants, usually teachers, in the past, as I do not accept that children intuitively know what they need to learn, and I contend that it is the responsibility of adults to convey both skills and essential knowledge to children. Throughout human evolution, children were actively taught what to do by adults around them. They learned much of the rest by observation and imitation, and a little bit by trial and error. Learning too much by trial and error would mean lots of errors at a time when errors could cost a child's life much more readily than they do today. If that's how we evolved, there is a good reason to believe that that's how we are wired. I'm not suggesting that we should always follow our primeval tendencies, but to suggest an educational philosophy that is based on a feel-good concept that is probably contradictory to the way our learning ability works is unlikely to be productive. As a minimum, I would hope that anyone proposing such a method would be able to provide evidence that it works. If I could have it my way, I would want to see education systems that are pluralistic, skill-focused, and evidence-based. But I'm afraid I'll have to dream on.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Skeptic Zone. Our special guest next week on the 1st of May, show number 28, is none other than Stephen Fry.
Sad, but people naturally want to cut corners, much as water wants to go the shortest route to the sea, so human beings want to go the shortest route to the truth. Unfortunately, it takes them the shortest route to bullshit, to the great ocean of bullshit that lies out there, and all those people who are prepared to make money out of them.
That's Stephen Fry appearing next week on The Skeptic Zone. Until then, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia.
You've been listening to The Skeptic Zone. Visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for comments, contacts, and extra video reports.
The Skeptic Zone.